Good evening. I'm Tom Hanchett. I'm glad to be here with you on behalf of Levine Museum of the New South for another installment in our ongoing series, The New South for the New Southerner. If you are just discovering Levine Museum of the New South, it's a history museum. It's in the center city of this great metropolis of Charlotte. And they're open again. I used to work there. I retired about 4 or 5 years ago. I was the staff historian. And tonight I am back to welcome some folks to talk about the book, The Ones We've Been Waiting For, how a new generation of leaders will transform, is transforming, has already begun to transform America to make history. And history is what Levine Museum is all about. It uses history to build community, helps people understand this place. Most of the folks who are online will have some connection to Charlotte. If you have never been to Charlotte, or if you're a Charlotte newcomer, the museum is a great place to check in with. It takes you through the reinventions of this city from after the Civil War all the way to the present, from slavery to segregation to civil rights, from fields to factories to finance, and the newest revolution that we're in the middle of that doesn't have a name. Part of it is a lot of newcomers. This is one of the fastest growing cities in the United States, and I think that's one reason why Charlotte Alter wanted to be sure to include it in the ones we've been waiting for. Charlotte Alter is here. She is on the road most of the time these days. She works for a publication you may have heard of, Time Magazine. She had a cover story on the Biden campaign earlier this year. And she comes by this all honestly. Her dad was a columnist at Newsweek for many years. Her mom, for a while, was executive producer of The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. So welcome, Charlotte Alter.
Thanks so much for having me, Tom. Appreciate it.
Glad to have you here. And the book that she wrote features a first-term city council person in Charlotte by the name of Braxton Winston. Braxton is with us. Braxton comes, well, he's one of the, like I am. I wasn't born here. He was born at Camp Lejeune, which at least is in North Carolina, but then his family went back to New York City, and he's been down here for quite a while, came as a student to Davidson, and got involved in the Keith Lamont Scott protests in 2016 and wound up on city council, which is a great thing about Charlotte. Braxton Winston, glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Tom. Good to see you, Charlotte.
Good to see you, Braxton.
And we're gonna have Charlotte talk a little bit about the book. She'll talk with Braxton a little bit, and then we're going to bring in Renee Gardner. Let's see Renee right now. She is not only a native of this area, but she is third generation native of Matthews, suburban town. Used to be a cotton gin town on the railroad outside the city. Now it's part of Charlotte suburbia. And a few years ago, she got involved in stopping a highway widening that would have dramatically changed the center city of Matthews. And more recently, got wound up about schools and ran for the town council and ended up with the highest number of votes. Congratulations, Mayor Pro Tem of Matthews, Renee Gardner.
Thanks so much for having me.
So those of you who are out there, you may have found there is a comment bar somewhere on your screen. You may have to hover to find it. We would love to have your comments. We would love to have your questions. And Alex Pineris with Levine Museum of the New South, who's pretty invisible generally, but he's going to be marshaling those comments. He's the person that's putting us out here and making us look good. So we really thank Alex Pineris and all the folks at Levine Museum. So let me start out and just do the obvious thing. And Charlotte Alter, what's this book about? It's about millennials. I'm not even sure what a millennial is. I have to check my calculator every time. But I like the new generation thing because that's really been going on in Charlotte.
Yeah, so the book is about millennial political leaders. So by millennial, I mean people born between 1980 and 1996. So it's mostly people who are in their late 20s, 30s. The oldest millennials are maybe even turning 40 this year. So it's about this kind of rising class of political leaders who are sort of pushing the envelope a little bit and approaching leadership differently on the national level, which we saw with Pete Buttigieg and even with somebody like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, on the federal level in Congress, people who are young Republicans and Democrats who are serving in Congress right now, on the state level and on the city level, which is why I was so happy to include Braxton in this book.
How did you hook up with him? How did you find him? I would imagine because his picture was all over the place during the Keith Lamont Scott protests. But
yeah, so I was approaching this book in a very specific way. I was not just trying. It wasn't just like who are the most famous young leaders, although certainly I tried to include some. I did include some familiar names like Pete Buttigieg and AOC and Dan Crenshaw's in there and Elise Stefanik. But what I was really looking for is young people whose lives had intersected in significant ways with the major trends that have defined this generation. So whether it's 9/11 or student debt, or the financial crisis, or the climate change movement. I specifically did not want somebody like, for example, Joe Kennedy III, who just sort of lived his whole life, went to law school, got into government, got into Congress, never really experienced anything that a lot of other people his age have experienced. And so I was really specifically looking to find somebody to represent the type of leader that came out of the Black Lives Matter movement. And one of the things that I found in researching that was actually until very recently, so this changed actually sort of over the course of writing this book, but until very recently, there had not been very many people who came out of Black Lives Matter who then sought elected office. So then when I started researching Braxton and I saw that he had been such a major figure in the Black Lives Matter movement in Charlotte around the killing of Keith Lamont Scott. And then I met him and I was like, oh my God, he's totally cool. He's approaching government in this totally different way. He's bringing in, all sorts of things that he learned in activism. He's bringing that into city council. I thought he was a really good figurehead for, how this movement around racial justice has shaped the way a lot of young leaders are thinking about government.
And we're going to turn you loose to talk one-on-one with Braxton. But I wanted to dig a little bit more into the issues that you're bringing up in the way that they've shaped folks. You start out with a number of your main characters who you're going to follow through the book, what they were doing as 9/11 happened. And that was pretty illustrative because some folks were working very workaday jobs. Some were in middle school. Most of them middle school. Middle school,
high school, most millennials. Yeah. Braxton, you were in high school, right?
It was my first week of college.
Sorry.
It was my first week of college. And, I think that's one of the things that Charlotte does really well in the book. It grounded me. It helped me put it in context, the kind of journey that I've been in over the past 4 years specifically, but really over the past 37 years of my life, because she identifies the spark in a lot of our journey. But that spark is really just something that pushed us kind of over an edge, in response to all of these worldly events that our generation has been part of. I think she points out, Charlotte, I think you point out, when you talk about my generation of leadership, you are talking about Katrina. You're talking about the first Black president. You're talking about now you're talking about Black Lives Matter, but you're talking also about coming of age in the .com time, right? Being the only generation that was pre-internet and post-internet. And that will never, that's a major shift, right? You talk about the coming of hip hop, the influence of Harry Potter, the way you look out in the world, that all of these things have been forming, but there are all these moments. And for many of us, it was 9/11. The first week of school for me really colored the rest of my career. And that's not something that many people can really understand, that weren't in college, on that day for the first time ever, and that has shaped us and shapes the way I look at things.
Charlotte, dig in here. I had planned on pontificating for a while longer, and I've got some questions to ask you, but Brax is teeing it up there. Talk more about these sparks that you identified.
Yeah. So one of the things I learned in researching this book was that, oh my gosh, my friend is calling me. How do I get rid of it? Decline. Okay. Sorry about that.
Millennials.
I know. Yeah. So great at technology, right? So one of the things I learned in researching this book was that, there's often this misconception that people's politics change a lot over the course of their lifetimes, right? That people start off as like hippies in the 1960s, and then they, suddenly by the time they're 40 years later, they're neocons or something like that. And of course that can happen with some people. I'm not trying to say that nobody ever changes their minds, but broadly speaking, researchers have found that actually lifelong political leanings are largely solidified in the years between, by the time you're between 18 and 26, give or take, really 14 and 26, because people start to pay attention, to the world around them, to the political, to the world that they're growing up in, even before they're able to vote, right? And that by the time you're 30, most people have pretty much figured out where they stand in terms of values systems, whether they, what is important to them, what they expect out of their government. And so one of the things that some researchers have tracked is how of the events of early adulthood shape lifelong political leanings. So things that happen when you're 18, 20, 22, 24 affect the way you think about politics for the rest of your life. And for example, they've found that, that popular presidents tend to attract young people to their party, and unpopular presidents tend to repel young people from their party, and that stays for life. So for example, that's why you see a lot of young people who turned 18, came of age in the 1980s under a popular Republican president in Ronald Reagan. A lot of those people are still Republicans, right? A lot of young people who came of age in the mid 1970s or early 1970s under Richard Nixon, an unpopular Republican president, a lot of those people are Democrats. So what I set out to do in this book is to try to isolate and analyze the forces, the life events, the historical events of early adulthood for this generation that might shape how they're thinking about things decades into the future. And so when I kind of sat down to look at it, I realized that, of course, there are many things that shape the way people think that are not in this book. As Braxton pointed out, Katrina only has a page or two in this book. That was a huge event. If you live in Louisiana, an entire generation of kids in Louisiana was shaped by that event. But I kind of set out to the events that I look at are 9/11, the financial crisis and the economic uncertainty that followed, which includes a lot of the student debt that this generation continues to carry. The major social movements of the early 2000s that mostly includes Occupy and Black Lives Matter, although now we're also seeing the rise of Sunrise and all of these other social movements that are building on a lot of those same ideas. The election of Barack Obama. I forgot the war in Iraq. That's a very important one. So 9/11, the war in Iraq, the financial crisis, these social movements, the election of Barack Obama, and then the election of Donald Trump. And then within that framework, there are also some broader trends, such as, like Braxton mentioned, the rise of technology, the fact that people our age one day are going to be the last people alive who remember what the world was like before the internet, which is a crazy thing to think about. Like 80 years in the future, God willing, we'll be saying to our grandkids, "Hey, we didn't have cell phones, when I was 10. Cell phones weren't, the internet wasn't really available to people until I was 12 years old or 15 years old or however old you were." That's going to be that's a real paradigm shift that our lifetimes that we've experienced over our lifetimes. So that's a little. I know I kind of pontificated a little bit, but that's the general idea.
Well,
and you make a point.
Go ahead, Brax.
You make a point of it in the book that it's what your book doesn't try to do. It doesn't try to necessarily define a millennial. It doesn't try to define something that makes us all the same. Like there's a certain politic that we have, but it really looks at it as the culture. I like to look at things through a cultural lens, how we do what we do. And when you deal with culture can be difficult to define because within one culture, you still have many different people that have different jobs but you kind of approach it from that cultural standpoint. And I don't think when we talk about millennials, we're often kind of just, I don't know, try to minimize it to an age or a certain fad or something like that. A stereotype. But you kind of approach it from a lens.
I'll tell you something in my own life that matches this, and then I want to ask Renee what spark might have shaped her civic activism. Someone did a longitudinal study, that's probably the wrong word, but a study of a whole bunch of people, including old people my age, I'm 65, and they looked at various propensities, and the anti-authoritarian thing just peaked with people who came of age like 1969 to 1974, at a point which not only did we have an unpopular president, but we had a war that the more you thought about it, the less sense it made. And there's a sense of people in my narrow cohort of not trusting the grownups, which is kind of bizarre because we're the grownups now. But I think what you're trying to do are say some of those same things that are going to keep impacting not just, why is Braxton, why is Renee right now, but what can we expect from other folks in the future as this unrolls? Renee, you have gotten yourself real active, and maybe you've been shaped by some kind of national events, local events, your parents. What made you an activist?
My parents probably were the initial reason I got into activism later, but my dad gave me a book when I was a kid about the environment and ways to save the environment. So I was going around the house putting bricks in the toilet and, making sure everybody recycled everything. And then that led up to getting organized in groups in college. And then, of course, Bush came along, and that was kind of that sealed the deal for me.
But you dug in close to home. You dug in.
I did. So, go ahead. I'm sorry.
You dug in Matthews. You're a graphic designer, which means you're part of the gig economy. You've created a website, helped people keep up with Matthews. And so what made you dig in close to home rather than going off to Washington or something, do you suppose?
I had plans to go to grad school, probably in San Francisco or New York or somewhere more exciting than Matthews, but something just kept me here. I started living in the house that my grandparents built, got really into gardening, and I found gardening to be really a revolutionary act. Started doing more and more of that. Never really imagined that Matthews was going to be my permanent home, but I seem to be
Braxton,
here now.
you kind of fell into Charlotte as well. You were here with Davidson, and you have also, I mean, you're a union stagehand, which means that you have a certain amount of security, but you're really enmeshed in this gig economy. The job changes every day. You have to go out and find the work every day.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I came down here for college. Like I said, 9/11 really impacted my first year, and I decided to go back home to New York for a while. Took a year off. Finally, I did a lot of soul searching, I guess you could say, and I decided to come back to Davidson. I was a real competitor. I didn't want to let my Davidson experience and the way the world was affecting me. I didn't want it to defeat me. So I challenged myself to come back. And then halfway through my Davidson, my second year at Davidson, I got really sick. And I got a MRSA, methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus. And this was another time in my life where this was the first time they had seen this illness really outside of the sickest places in hospitals. And that affected my education once again. I had to go to the CDC to get treatment for that, and it affected my education again. And I found myself in a situation where I had to provide for myself. I couldn't go back to school. I didn't have the same financial aid, and somebody from the Davidson community put me really in contact with the world of entertainment production, and I became a stagehand, and I loved it. So I was in the business of, I guess, being a true millennial, right? Taking my time in college, taking the extended plan, working a bunch of gigs, and then dealing with the world around me. I ended up finishing at Davidson while I was working full time. And so I found myself as being a full-time student and pursuing a career full time. I followed that career, followed it out to LA for a couple years, went back to New York, and the world brought me back down to Charlotte in 2011. I could have gotten a gig anywhere else, but I had a support system here. I lived in 3 different states in 3 years, but I ended up back in Charlotte. And again, it was something that was brought up in Charlotte's book. Between the time I first left Davidson in 2004, the second time I left in 2004, and by the time I moved back here to today, I've had several different jobs and gigs, driven for Lyft, driven for Uber. That's what I was doing at the time of Keith Lamont Scott, on top of trying to break into the film and TV side, working on a TV set when Outcast was being filmed here, and Shots Fired, while still working at the arena. And my tax time, my W-2s and 1099s were wild. And so that's how I found myself here, and that's how when I did run for office, I kind of brought all of those pieces came together. All of a sudden, I realized that I was in a bunch of different circles, although I'd never looked at it from a government standpoint. So that was really helpful when I was able to have those shared experiences. Again, the same experiences as a lot of different people in the community that were shaped, from all of these lifelong experiences and why they came about,
Charlotte, is his story a typical one? Why are folks getting into government in a big way, or are things like student loans making them slower to get into civic activism than folks in my age might have been?
So, sort of yes and no. So there is this surge. So, okay, I think let me start with the no. So right after Barack Obama, one of the sort of inadvertent failures of the Barack Obama presidency was that even though he inspired so many young people with his hope and change message, and he was, absolutely the candidate of young Americans, millennials and young people actually didn't really run for office in record numbers during his presidency. In fact, it was sort of a sluggish time for new faces in government. And that's partly because Obama himself didn't really feed and water the state parties in the way that, would have been smart for him to do. He had this tremendous campaign apparatus that he ran for president with twice. And then sort of both times he kind of like packed it up and went home and didn't really, leave his organizers there to continue to build infrastructure for more other people to run. But more structurally, it's not a coincidence, or it is an unhappy coincidence that has, that basically at the exact same time that you have a generation coming into adulthood with record amounts of debt, that also happens to be the time that the cost of running for office skyrockets. So it's much, much more expensive to run for a state Senate seat or a congressional seat in 2018 than it was in 1988. And so it's, if young people are saddled with so much debt that they can't even consider buying a house, or they're having trouble, saving up enough money to get married or start a family, having $200,000 on hand to run a political campaign, or having friends who have enough money that you can raise $200,000 to run a political campaign is just totally prohibitive for a lot of young people.
And that's where I was honestly very lucky. And personally, and it continues to be the case, that it's not a convenient time in my life to be doing this. I don't have the accumulated wealth to be able to do this. But because I was in the Davidson circle, because I have the union circle, I'm able to go to labor organizations and their membership. Because of the activism, where I have the ears and eyes of the corporate community, as well as other foundations and important people, all of those things came together because I wasn't saying anything different. I haven't been saying anything different than, the conversations I was having, at the bar after work. But all of a sudden, I'm able to have the type of resources that it does take. I mean, there are a ton of leaders. And what I saw, and what really inspired me in 2016, was that I saw so many leaders in Charlotte on the streets that were saying the things that was presenting the ideas that needed to be considered. But because they were not yet being put in the place to have the political capital to advocate and lobby for those situations, those ideas aren't being heard. So I recognize my privilege, at that time. But again, it was because of that spark. As you go through it. When I was, the Iraq War, 9/11 could have been something like that for me, but I couldn't take the step that Dan Crenshaw took and join the armed forces, not because it wasn't in my blood. My father's a Marine, but my politics couldn't put me there. It wasn't a situation necessarily when Barack Obama ran for office that I could just drop everything and go and join the campaign. But that was my time, and where all of those privileges, kind of came together at the right time to allow me to take this step.
If you're just joining us, if you're finding us on Facebook Live or whatever, we're talking about this very shiny book, The Ones We've Been Waiting For, How a New Generation of Leaders Will Transform America. And Charlotte Alter is here from Time Magazine. She reported this and thought it up. And Braxton Winston from Charlotte City Council. And Renee Garner, who you kind of did your entry into civic activism the way folks in my generation did, fighting a highway. There was a lot of highways to fight when I was a young person, but you found one in Matthews. Talk a little bit about the John Street thing and how that pulled you into being a person out front in your community. I should say that most of these people, Braxton and Renee, are dressed the way they dress all the time. And somebody of my age, but yeah, the two of us are a little bit dressed up. You guys are not dressed up. And I've been around with both of you. And
I'm wearing leggings, Tom.
Everybody comes up and talks to Braxton. They're all talking to him. Same thing with Renee. I went and played music down in a little pub in Matthews and kept sitting at Renee's table and talking with her. That's how I figured out who she was. I had no idea. So, but this approachability that Braxton's talking about, Renee, talk about your story a little bit, because folks here probably are less aware of that than they are of Braxton's.
Well, I guess I should go back and touch on that. We do live, my husband and I both have gig careers. So my husband's a photographer and I'm an artist, and we are not, we're probably lower middle class if you want to put us in the income bracket. And I think that's a benefit of running for office in Matthews or somewhere like Matthews, is that you don't have to have access to a lot of funds to run for office. And my campaign was about $2,000, which I'm sure for Braxton is like, one donation or something, but it was built on $25 donations. And so in 2016, I found out about this highway going through Matthews, and I like to research and I like to read, and I have the time to do it. So I got the environmental assessment for this project and read it and realized that this $85 million project that NCDOT was doing was destined to fail after 5 years, right? And it was in their document, and I thought that was just like insane to me. Everybody else thought it was a great idea, and why would we run a highway through a historic district that was going to shape the town in a totally different way if it was just destined to fail from the outset? And so, knowing how websites work and knowing social media, I could just instantly put the information out there, let people know what was going on and where to find out, what a bad idea this road was, and people latched onto it.
Muted, Tom. What?
Oh, I'm muted. I'm sorry. I was going to get Renee to take us into her next stage, where she actually didn't just fight the widening of John Street. If you don't know Matthews, part of the approach to Matthews from Charlotte is Monroe Road. Then it turns into John Street, kind of narrows down to a kind of tight 4 lanes. There are all these old buildings, and then boom, it's Monroe Road again. And they wanted to kind of edit the old building some. But it was a school issue that got you to actually run for town council.
Yeah, that's right. So our former representative created this municipal charter school bill, which would essentially allow Matthews to create its own school district. And again, researched it, looked into it, realized what that meant for Matthews, which is 82% white, and what that would do to the county school system as a whole. I didn't know any parents that were for this idea. I didn't know. I didn't feel like it was a good idea myself, but I sat in on town meetings, listened to how the conversation was framed, and I guess more seasoned politicians had control of the conversation, what was allowed to be said, what was not allowed to be said, in pushing the issue. Well, when election time came around, the mayor and I were both elected simply because, well, not simply because, I won't say that, but largely because we realized what a bad idea this charter school bill was for Matthews. I mean, it would create basically a white school district outside of a racially diverse school district. And in this day, I don't think many parents really want that.
Powerful moment, a somewhat unexpected moment, and a moment that in some ways foreshadowed the alliances that are being built right this moment with Black Lives Matter, where so many of the folks who are out protesting are not African American. Charlotte or Braxton, you want to comment on that?
Well, one thing I wanted to say, you mentioned earlier about the kind of come as you are in terms of the way you approach, the way we dress, the way I look. Again, something that kind of further contextualized, a message from the book that further contextualized the journey that I find myself on is that, there's so many of these social constructs that say you have to, like you said, have to own a house. You can't be in debt. You have to have grown kids. You have to have a certain type of job, a certain level of job, or in a certain industry to assert yourself, whether it be in government, whether it be in advocacy. And we kind of look at ourselves and it's like, well, if I wait for that, it's never going to happen. It's never going to be my time because I'm never going to get out of student debt, for instance, or the ability to get on a career track where I'll have a retirement. I don't see that as being possible. I feel like I'm always going to have to work. And so, I think there's so many of us in that book that there's a time where we just said, you know what, again, this moment said, F that, I'm just I have to go and I got to make a move. I got to make a move. And if not now, then when? And if not me, then who? And so that's kind of what I take. I think that's what Renee takes. And honestly, that resonates with people because every generation is told that, right? Every generation is and I'm getting to a point where I'm in a generation that we're not young anymore. There's a generation below us that continues to push the boundaries. So that has been something that I've employed. And I feel like that's what this kind of new crop or whatever of elected officials around the country are employing. I'm thinking it shows on all sides. Look at Matt Gaetz, for instance, right? I don't think he cares what the critics say. He's going to go and speak in the way that he feels resonates to his folks. Same thing with the Elise Stefanik up in New York, AOC, Dan Crenshaw. I'm going to be doing a Harvard class with Eric Lesser, who is another person in the book. He takes that Western, he does that in his fashion in Western Massachusetts, which wouldn't necessarily work for me. But it's a I don't know. I think it casts a bigger net, in terms of government. I learned that before I was elected, when I would just show up and live stream city council meetings. I would see that 400 people would tune in. So if I bring ideas and information to them in a way that's comfortable, in a way that's authentic, people feel more empowered, to participate.
Charlotte, talk about how this resonates off of the things that you're seeing nationwide.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with everything that Braxton and Renee just said. And, one of the things that one of the reasons that this has been such an interesting time is that I think that that the Trump presidency has been that sort of kick in the rear for a lot of people who maybe kind of thought to themselves, Obama's in charge, things seem normal, I'm going to focus on my life. And, this is not about me. Government is not my problem. And the last 4 years for many young people have proven to be kind of a wake-up call. There are a lot of young people who now see that many of the issues that they care most about, particularly climate change and racial justice, which are two issues, and student debt, which are two issues that many, many young people kind of put near the top of their list of priorities. They're beginning to see that unless they have people representing them in government who agree, who at least take these issues seriously, that they're never really going to be addressed. So one of the things that I kind of argue in the book is that, listen, I am not saying that millennials are all in agreement on anything. There are many, this generation does tilt towards the Democrats for reasons that I lay out in the book, but there are a lot of millennial Republicans. They're doing a lot of great work all over the place. I'm not trying to say that, all millennials are liberal or socialist or progressive. One thing that I did notice, though, is that while millennial Democrats and millennial Republicans, oh my God, that was so cute. Renee, was that your husband? That was adorable. Was that while millennial Democrats and millennial Republicans don't always agree on the solutions, they do tend to agree on what the problems are, in a way that older generations, there is often more conflict around that. So, for example, climate change is a great example of this. You don't have to, even for conservatives, you don't have to convince anybody who's under the age of 40 that climate change is real and that it's created by humans and that something has to be done to address it. The fight is over what to do. How much should government be involved? How much should it be social programs? How much should it be a carbon tax? Should we do this solution, a market-based solution, a government-based solution? That's all a conversation that's going to be hashed out over the next 20 or 30 years when this rising generation, continues to gain more power on the federal level. What you don't have is people like Jim Inhofe, who's 87 years old now, or maybe he's 86, bringing a snowball onto the floor of the Senate in order to argue that climate change is not real. So it's a question of bringing of issues, many issues that, previous generations, the boomer generation, for example, kind of kept on the back burner, now being brought to the front burner as sort of an acknowledgement of like, hey, listen, these are the things that are important to young people. We have to hash out some kind of agreement to deal with them. There's going to be partisan differences on what to do about it, but at least among millennial leaders, there is a little bit more of a agreement on at least like where to start, what to focus on. And so I think that's one of the things that is going to continue to change as more and more young people get elected. And by the way, one of the things that I argue in this book, and I hope this doesn't make people uncomfortable, but this is a fact of life. It's not a question as to whether or not young people will take over the American government. It's just a question of when. I mean, right now we have a presidential election between a 74-year-old and a 77-year-old. The fact that there was a COVID-19 super spreader event, likely COVID-19 super spreader event at the White House, the reason that is so alarming is because the Senate has so many octogenarians in it and septuagenarians and people who are uniquely vulnerable to this virus. So in some ways, even just the events of the last 2 weeks have highlighted how old the people in charge of our government are. And I would like to meet somebody who argues that that's a sustainable situation, because I just don't think that it is.
We have questions started to come in. If you have not found the comment section, please put a comment down there. Housing activist in Charlotte saying, how do you all think the experience with COVID is going to uniquely impact this new generation, this rising generation that Charlotte talks about in her book? And that's a question, I think, for all of the folks on our Zoom here. What do you think?
Yeah,
I'm going to kill off my.
Well, you said it, not me. I think one of what Charlotte brings up is one of the main ways. One, there is going to be a new generation. Whether COVID is here or not, there's a natural progression of things. But it really is, I think, about what we've all been asking ourselves over these past 6-7 months is what is government's role in some of the things that we do. I can tell you that myself and, for instance, Tariq Bokhari, who was another millennial, but he's Republican. We have wildly different interpretations of what role of how government should go about doing things. But I can tell you here, we saw very early on that digital divide was an issue. This was something that we were already working on. We were already saw. We're trying to figure out a way to get our local government to understand that this is a priority, and this is we play a role in this. Again, from my perspective, I might want to talk about the potential, public works factor of getting everybody, the infrastructure investment that needs to happen to bridge this digital divide. He might not want to have that conversation, as much as he might want to talk about the economic development factors and job training aspects of those things. But either way, we can wrestle over the details of it. But this big idea, the role of the representative in government, of the elected official, is to get governments to kind of, is to turn the battleship, and it's to use a metaphor, is to make these big ideas get attacked by our systems. And that can be a very difficult thing because our systems are just not used to that. They're not used to thinking about these new ideas. So as we try to kind of massage what the role of government is to keep people housed, to keep people fed, to keep people healthy, I think that's going to be the biggest impact.
Renee, thoughts you might have about COVID and the lessons we're learning or not learning right now?
Well, I guess in Matthews, when COVID hit, we were just realizing, and this is going to sound naive, how much we needed to pay attention to housing, how many residents of Matthews were on the verge of homeless and were living in, the extended stay suites. And so those are issues that are new to Matthews that that previous board members had never had to deal with. It just shapes, I think, for leadership, it shapes our thoughts, how we approach leadership, and creates a whole new system of thinking. And from that, I think, we really have to, but when I ran, the average age on our board was 62. Yeah. It's hard to, the saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I mean, it's hard to change minds, right? When you're the younger voice on the board. And that's not to say people didn't, but it certainly made, I definitely felt like I needed to be the voice pushing for some of these changes we had to make. But on the same, and Braxton probably didn't want to talk about this, but on the same thread, I've got kids, right? And living in our economy, my husband was laid off from his job. We didn't have health insurance for 3 months. We had to figure out how we could meet as a board without putting my kids at risk. My kids still don't have health insurance. You don't get paid enough when you're in government to afford health insurance. Certainly not go to a hospital and get special treatment.
And that's a legitimate, part of the conversation. Something I got, I talked about literally the first day, of being on the job. This job is, I was still working multiple gigs, so I couldn't, when a city council member gets paid about $25,000 a year, You don't get health insurance. You don't get to pay into those retirement systems. I mean, you do get health insurance if you want to pay the exorbitant amount in relation to your income, because you have kids. These jobs are not set up for people like us.
No, they're not
at all. And they should be. The whole idea of democracy is that, that anybody could hold elected office. There's not one particular vocation or experience, that is supposed to, be a gateway to serving. It's that desire to serve. It's that patience and willingness, to be a servant to people. It's not one politics that allows you to do that. So that's a big one. It's really hard to have those conversations. When you go out and have those conversations, you're supposed to do it in a certain way. You're supposed to do it at a certain time. Not before you deal with this. Not before you get elected. Come on, what are we waiting for?
But I couldn't have imagined running and having this come up. So COVID really brought out some big issues, right? And so I think for millennials in politics, COVID really sets up that we have to work to make some changes so that people in our position can run and be okay if there's another pandemic or crisis.
Wow, that's powerful. We have a question from a person who's watching on the Facebook Live. Question specifically for Charlotte Alter. How did you overcome the lens of white privilege as you wrote your book?
That is a great question. I don't know that I can ever fully overcome that lens. I can only kind of do my best to try to overcome that lens. And the way that I tried to do it is, obviously I wanted to make sure to include a diverse cast of characters, which I think I did. But also, particularly when talking about some of these broader trends among millennials, for example, trends in student debt, trends in housing, trends in health insurance access, trends in the gig economy, trends in marriage rates, which is often tied to financial security. There are racial disparities within a lot of those trends. So if overall the rate of millennials who have student debt, and forgive me, it's been a presidential election season, so my brain is a little bit scrambled right now, so I don't want to quote exact numbers for you, but if the overall rate of millennials with student debt is it's in the high 30%, 36%, I believe it is. Among Black millennials, it's actually significantly higher. And so it's important when you're talking about these trends to note that, for millennials of color, they experience many of these same trends that millennials broadly experience, but often compounded by the additional injustice of race. And I also, it was important to me, particularly in writing about Black Lives Matter, I know that I am a white person writing about this. I also know that it's one of the most important and transformative social movements of the last 20 years. So it would have felt irresponsible for me to not include it in this book. However, particularly with a movement like Black Lives Matter, which was very, as I write in the book, very disparate. There were some major events like Ferguson or, the events this summer in Minneapolis around George Floyd. Like there were some hotspot events, but what was so unique about Black Lives Matter is that these protests could kind of erupt spontaneously across the country because there was no one Martin Luther King Jr. who decided what everybody was doing. And that was one of the reasons I was really excited to feature Braxton, because, I don't know that the Keith Lamont Scott protests were as famous, for example, as the Eric Garner protests or the Michael Brown protests, but they still are part of this movement. They still, illustrate the breadth of this problem of police violence and systemic injustice for Black Americans. And, and also I wanted to include Keith Lamont Scott because that was the protest that Braxton was involved in. So, it's tricky, particularly with Black Lives Matter, because people say, well, why did you include this and not that? Why were you focused on Keith Lamont Scott and not Michael Brown? And ultimately, those are just decisions I have to make because the Keith Lamont Scott protests gave rise to somebody like Braxton Winston. And that was the story that I was telling. So, but I appreciate the question because
I'll say one of the things that she did really well in this was just to be an objective journalist and tell a story. So when she got to my part, she really did look at the live streams from that I did from Keith Lamont Scott in September 2016. And I still really haven't, there's about 20 hours of footage. So I've never really watched them all the way through. So as I was sitting there reading, and from the conversations that she had, that she and I had, she really did walk us through the key moments for me, the personal moments in me when I had to, the times that really changed me out there. It's hard to explain, but the decisions that I had to make, and the real, there was a time when I literally said, when on that first night, I'm looking to follow somebody. Where's the Martin Luther King, right? Where's the Malcolm X? But you realize that, they didn't necessarily know that they were MLK or Malcolm X at some point in time. And at some point in time, you just got to stand up. Right. And do that thing. There's a reason why I had all this education. There's a reason why I had all these. I mean, it was in front of me right then and there. So what Charlotte was able to do was to listen to me and listen to the people that were out on the street in Charlotte through the live streams and tell an accurate depiction that fully contextualized the 33 years before that led up to how I experienced what we experienced in Charlotte in 2016.
So we're talking to Braxton Winston, Charlotte City Council, Renee Gardner, Mayor Pro Tem at Town and Matthews, about Charlotte Alter's book. I've got to wave it in front of the camera. Here we go. The ones we've been waiting for, How a New Generation of Leaders Will Transform America. We have just a couple of minutes left, and early on in the book, Charlotte Alter has a provocative sentence, and maybe each of you could come up with one way that you think a country run, quote, a country run by millennials will look different than boomer-built America. Renee, what's one way that a country run by y'all's people will look different than the one that I'm handing off to you?
Oh, well, I think it's going to be, it's going to be, I don't know. I guess this is the $1 billion question. It really is the $1 billion question. I was just thinking, when you asked the earlier question, right now we're living in a time where, the 18-year-olds that are about to take over this next generation are having a heck of a 2020, So it's not about, what is going to become really. And I think Charlotte might get to this in the book, is that it's now, this is what it starts to look like. And yes, we're going to have to kind of, scratch and claw to some of the highest levels of leadership. But the fights that we're having now around that climate change is real. The idea that, that I don't know, that healthcare could be a right, that housing should be a right. We're going to really struggle over this next generation about continuing to define what rights are. I think we're going to have some pretty significant conversations, cultural, not just political, about what that looks like. And we're going to have to reckon with that. And I don't think that has been reckoned with over the last generation. The last generation was really about building wealth, individual wealth. And so that's how I see. And I think that's happening right now.
Renee, you're up.
Well, I think, and we've touched on this a couple of times, that previous generations have framed conversations in certain ways. And you speak within this sort of box of what you're allowed to say, right? And we've seen enough just traumatic events in such a short time. We're watching climate change, and we realize that there's not time to frame those conversations. We have to have them now. And I think that's what, we'll carry forward. We're just going to keep having difficult conversations and not exclude certain things because they're uncomfortable.
I didn't expect that answer. That's a really good answer. Both of those are really thoughtful. Charlotte Alter, you have the last word. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate all of the work and thought that went into this and what you're doing with Time Magazine and all the rest of your career. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tom, for having me, and Braxton for being such a great subject for this book. And Renee, it's so nice to meet you. It's so nice to hear about what you're doing in Matthews. I think that the main way that it kind of touches on what Renee was saying and what Braxton was saying. I think the main way that a millennial-led America is going to be different is going to be that there's going to be more focus on structural change, whether that's addressing structural inequality, whether that's addressing health structures around healthcare, structures around housing. There will be more focus on building a 21st century social safety net that, by the way, may not look exactly like young progressive activists think it's going to look. It may not exactly be Medicare for all, or exactly a Green New Deal, or exactly any of these, free college, or any of the things that the young people who supported Bernie Sanders, advocated for. But I would be really surprised if, after this rising generation is done with it, if there is not something that resembles a new type of 21st century safety net for a new 21st century economy, where people are working different types of jobs, where people's healthcare, their literal physical ability to live is tied to the kind of employment they have. So I do think that this generation is going to be filling in a lot of those holes that have been left by previous generations, sort of eating away at the social safety net that was established in the 1930s and 60s.
A lot to think about. Thank you, Charlotte Alter. Thank you, Renee Gardner. Thank you, Braxton Winston. Really appreciate all the folks behind the scenes at Levine Museum of the New South, Kemba Pierce and Courtney in communications, and Alex Pineras, who's been our behind the scenes host and prompter here. But most of all, thank you. And thank you for supporting Levine Museum of the New South, nonprofit here in Charlotte. You know what that means in the age of COVID rather. And also there is, I think in the chat, in the comments, a Survey Monkey thing that will allow us to figure out if we did anything right and things we could do better next time. And so once again, thank you to Charlotte, Braxton, Renee, and to you.